Today I'm going to be talking about the most powerful tool producers have to analyze and learn about music from their favorite producers and other musicians, and that's the Spectrum Analyzer. Today I'm going to be using Ableton Spectrum Analyzer, or you can also use Voxengo Span Spectrum Analyzer, which is 100% free, and I'm going to show you in today's video what settings I use in Voxengo Span that most closely mimic Ableton Spectrum Analyzer so that you can use it for these specific tasks. So before we begin, I needed to explain what is a Spectrum Analyzer and what is it showing us. And if you zoom in here to our DAW, I'm using Ableton Live, you can see these little jagged peaks. This is literally what the sound is in the real world. Sound is, of course, vibrations in the air, and the way the air vibrates, our ears pick it up as sound. And so this all goes back to a guy named Joseph Fourier. And Joseph Fourier was a French mathematician, and he was studying heat transfer. And he had this theory that you could approximate any mathematical function with a series of sine waves. And by just adding an infinite number of sine waves together, you could essentially approximate any function. And this led to the development of a mathematical theory called the Fourier transform. And the Fourier transform essentially does the opposite. It takes a wave, as you can see here in the bottom right corner, it takes any single wave and tries to decompose it into its corresponding addition of sine waves. And so let me give you an example here. So we're going to take a single sine wave, and we're going to create a square wave out of it. And a square wave is defined as a very specific combination of sine waves that are added together. And this label, as I move from n to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can see how it more and more closely approximates a square wave the more we keep adding to it. And that's all that Spectrum Analyzer is. Spectrum Analyzers are the Fourier transform of the sound. And this is what it looks like. Fourier's theory of the addition of sine waves led to the idea of a fundamental frequency. And the fundamental frequency is defined as the lowest possible major frequency contributor of the whole sound. So if we were to look at the square wave, for example, I just showed earlier, it's the wave with the slowest oscillation rate. And in Spectrum Analyzer, that's whatever is going to be on the furthest left-hand side. So in this piano note, this peak up here, sitting at C3, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, this peak is the lowest possible oscillation frequency in this piano note. And thus we would say this piano note has a fundamental of C3, and this is the note that we perceive when we think about when we play piano or a keyboard or any music theory. But we notice there's other peaks around here too. These are called the harmonics of the sound, and every sound has very unique harmonic structure. I'm going to just show you guys a couple basic sounds for you to understand. So first, the most basic sound is a sine wave. So look at a sine wave on a Spectrum Analyzer. There is only one single peak, nothing else. Now we look at a saw wave. We see lots of peaks. We see a peak here at C. We see a peak at C4, G4, and C5. So notice there's an octave plus a fifth, 2-octave difference. This is the characteristic harmonic structure of a saw wave. And then the characteristic harmonic structure of a square wave is this. Notice instead of the saw wave where we would have the octave and the second octave, they're missing the octaves, but the octave plus a fifth. I want to try to explain to you how to start learning how to use our Spectrum Analyzers and applying it to music production. And really what you need to do is, I suggest just taking Spectrum Analyzer and putting it in your master channel and then in your project. So whenever you're listening to a sound or a song, or you're thinking about music, just throw it in a Spectrum Analyzer and just watch it as it moves around, and you'll start to get a hang for what you're looking at. And what I really mean by this is you start to notice specific peaks which move up and down in conjunction with each other, and those typically indicate that they're both part of the same instrument. So let me give you an example from my most recent single, Take It Slow. there's a lot of information going on here, but let's start trying to break it down. So a couple of things that you should take into consideration. Look at these peaks here in the middle. And notice that this peak in the middle comes up at the same time as these two little peaks over here do. This peak and this peak come up at the same time together, and these peaks come up together, but they fall at a different rate than this peak does. That is the vocal saying O. And that's the bell sort of playing a counter melody in the second half of the drop. And so I really want to focus on the fundamental frequencies. So although we see these peaks here, all these peaks together moving at the same as each other, what I really care about is the fundamental down here, because these peaks are usually inharmonic because they're bells, versus this one is going to be like the main tonal part of our sound. We'll see this peak right here. That's the sub peak. And spectrum analyzers are particularly useful for analyzing bass and sub frequencies because they're very easy to see. It's a little bit harder to see, but you can see sort of right here and right here are the harmonics of the vocal, and they will go up and down on their own, independent of everything else. A lot of this just takes time to just sitting down and watching it, but eventually you start to pick up the small patterns and you start seeing instruments within this sort of larger chaos of peaks. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about the first major use of how I use spectrum analyzers, and that is using it to help me with transcribing songs. And first I'm going to show you how I transcribe songs, then I'm going to talk about what information you can get from transcribing songs and how this can help your productions. So first of all, the easiest thing to usually transcribe from a song is the bass line, because the subfrequencies are usually very prominent and they're very clear from everything else. We can transcribe the bass line. So I'll show you how to transcribe the bass line from my song. And so all these four peaks here, these are the fundamental frequencies of my sub. And we see that the song goes E, G, B, A. And we can take that into a MIDI roll and type in E, G, B, A. And that's going to be our bass line. Now for other instruments, we can also transcribe melodies and chords. So for example, I'm going to transcribe the counter melody, the second half of the drop, which I talked about earlier. And so what I would usually do is I would first try to figure out what the fundamental frequency of the instrument I'm trying to transcribe is. And so I listen around, I notice, okay, these peaks right here seem to be the lowest frequency that I can see that make up the sound that seems to come up when I hear the sound. So you have to sort of use both your ears and your eyes at the same time for this. And then I usually get a piece of paper out, and I will just start writing down the notes in what order they come in. So this first note was E. So it goes E, 4, B, 3, D. Then it goes D, E, F sharp, and so on. And you can do this process one note at a time, and eventually you can recreate the melody. And this is a really interesting way, a really easy way to recreate melodies and figure out things from a song that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do by ear. Like, I have no formal training in music, so I don't really know how to play any instruments, and I have a hard time, transcribing and figuring out notes and stuff. And this is a super easy way. You can do this with literally anything. For example, you can take samples, which we've never maybe seen the tonality for before, and you can like this piano note here. Even all of this piano note is labeled with a C3. If I didn't know what note it was, I could just open up a spectrum analyzer and look at the note, and it says, oh, C3. And this is a really easy way to tune certain instruments. I'm going to show you a little bit how you can tune drums and basses and that sort of stuff a little bit later. Alright, so for some more advanced transcription strategies, you can transcribe entire songs with chord structures, and particularly I've been really interested recently in figuring out how vocal melodies are written, and so I've been trying to transcribe vocal melodies. So I actually transcribed the vocal melody from Flume's song Say It.
Feeling the done, shadows walking home, walking with a game on. You are my kind, classic mind, and you look so.
I did the same thing I was explained before. You have a spectrum analyzer. So first you have to identify where the voice is.
Feeling the sun party done, shadows walking home.
You can see the peaks right here. We're moving up and down quite a bit. That's the vocal.
Feeling the sun feeling the sun party, feeling the sun party done, shadows walking home.
And this can be a bit tedious at times, especially if you're going to be really precise with it, but it really doesn't take more than maybe an hour or so to transcribe one of these songs. And the value you gain from it is enormous, which I'm going to talk about in a brief moment. And you can also do this for chords as well. So I also transcribed the chord progression, and not just the triads, but I really wanted to see how those chords are voiced. And these are the chords I found were used. And these may not be exactly right, but the chord, at least some of the notes being used, are right. And if you're just doing this by ear, it'd be really hard to transcribe some of these notes, because some of these chords, because these chords have weird notes in them. They have added notes that are really hard to hear unless you maybe have perfect pitch. That it'd be difficult to just make this on your own. With the spectrum analyzer, you can find the individual peaks in the sound which correlate to what note the artist used.
Feeling the sun party done, feeling the sun party done, shadows walking home, walking with a game on.
And a second example of doing this is I was interested in the song Build a Beat recently, and I wanted to recreate the song. And so I went through and I did the same thing.
Say build a bitch, you don't get to pick and choose.
And so I'm able to do all this without any musical training, just by using the spectrum analyzer. And this is very useful for somebody who's trying to teach themselves music theory and trying to figure out how to write better music. So what's the use of transcribing anyways? This is really important, because without this, you don't really understand why you're transcribing stuff, and you don't see the importance of using spectrum analyzers. And transcribing things helps you understand the structure, the melodic structure, and the way that songs are organized in a way that's really hard to see without the transcriptions. For example, when I did Flume's Say It, I was really amazed to see that I mean, retrospectively, maybe it was obvious, but the melody that the vocal is singing actually stays the same. And the words change, but the melody stays the same. This is a very new idea for me, which I had never thought of before.
Feeling the sun party done, shadows walking home, loving the cold, smoking roll, see your fingers shake.
And maybe there's like small differences, but for the most part the melody is identical in each half of the verse. And the melody repeats itself, but the words change, giving the song a feeling of progression. And this is very interesting to me, because it made me realize how integral and how important the melody behind the vocals are for creating like a pop song like this. And similarly, I was analyzing the vocal melody of Build a Beat, and I was trying to think, I heard the song was produced by Suburban, I'm a big fan of, and I wanted to think, how does he go about writing all these intricate melodies in the song? because there's like 5 or 6 melodies being used, and I realized that actually all the melodies are essentially derivations of one melody. The artist has taken one melody and they've broken it up into a bunch of smaller little melodies which play little riffs all contained within the main melody. So for example, this is the intro vocal melody, and this is the intro melody being played by like the bell sound in the very beginning. And you can see as I overlay the two notes together, the entire intro melody, instrument melody, is contained within the vocal melody. And later on in the song, if we're looking at the drop melody and looking at the pre-chorus melody, you can see again that the pre-chorus melody is almost entirely, give her maybe 1 or 2 notes. The pre-chorus melody is just the entire chorus melody, but minus a couple notes. And so this is very interesting to me because this gives me a very tangible idea of, or strategies of how to write music and how to organize my melodies into a catchy song. Another cool thing you can do with the transcription aspect of using spectrum analyzers is tuning drums and finding like the tuning of, like, say, an 808 that's not been labeled in a pack. So for example, I have this kick here, and I can look up a spectrum analyzer and I can look at the fundamental of this kick. And you can see it's sitting down here around G0. And I can move it around to repitch the kick. So you can see this pick actually came as a F sharp. But the song I was using to recreate it was a G. So I pitched the kick up in 1 semitone. And this applies to some snares that do not have tonality, like this first snare doesn't really have a tone. If you look in a spectrum analyzer, not much of a single tone. But this snare does. And this is a really easy way to check your drums and see if they're in tune or not. You don't have to always use in tune drums, but it's sometimes just good to know if they are, so you're more intentional about the decisions you're making. And this also goes for 808s. So here's an 808 for a remake I'll talk about later. And so say you got this in a sample pack, just some bass hit. You don't know what key it's in, maybe it's not been labeled properly. What you can do is open a spectrum analyzer and just hover over the main peak here of the fundamental, and you see, oh, that's a D0. And then you can put that into a sampler and then repitch it so that it's from a C, so you maybe pitch it down 2 semitones. Or you pitch it up, and it's a super simple way of finding out the key of a specific sample. So the second major thing that I use spectrum analyzers for is to help me with remakes. And I think that remaking other songs is one of the best ways to grow as an artist and figure out, learn production techniques, learn writing techniques, and just understand what your favorite artists are doing in their music. And so for example, I can show you guys, I tried to remake the drop from Vincent's song I'm No Magician. This is my remake. And so you can see it sounds pretty similar. That's because I use a spectrum analyzer to help me understand how he made this bass sound. And I think that you can use spectrum analyzers to help you remake leads, but it's a little bit trickier because there's less sort of detail in the 1K range, versus in the sub frequencies it's very detailed and I can figure out exactly what's going on in the sub. So we take a second to look at the sub from this song. So again, we see the sub here is at a C0. And then the first peak harmonica is a G, and then an E2. If you remember from earlier, this is the characteristic shape of a square wave. So the sub is some sort of square sub. But there's some little peaks here, the C1, the C2, which just, there's a little bit of a saw character as well. So I want to make some sort of like saw square sort of hybrid. And the way I did that is I used Serum. And essentially it is, I just used the waveform editor just to make the first 3 harmonics of a square wave. And then I just took a saw wave and removed the first 3 harmonics so I could mix in relative amounts of saw and square together to give me, you know, the character that I wanted. And then I just printed that out, added some saturation, and there's the bass. And it really has the tonality. I mean, even just having the square with the first 3 harmonics gives a lot of the tonality that I think defines this 808, and it makes a super strong, super interesting bass. Alright, now I'm going to talk about my favorite use of spectrum analyzers, and this is some more advanced techniques. Is the use of a spectrum analyzer in conjunction with some effect before it, so that you can isolate parts of the sound profile to analyze. So for example, I have this thing called side only, and the way I created this EQ was I took a mid-side EQ and just took away all the mids. And what this should do is it should only give us the information that we hear in the sides. And this is very useful for checking the sides of your mix and understanding how your favorite artists place certain objects in the stereo field. So for example, the song the Wheatland's Perfect Places remix, if you analyze the drop of it, you think to yourself, oh, I want to make something similar to that, how am I going to do that? Well, the question you have to ask yourself in the mixing stage is, where do I space my elements in the mix? What goes where? What's mono, what's stereo? And we can see using this side only information. Also, you'll need to change the channel from left and right to R and L. It's a completely different song. Go. And by using a mid-side EQ, such as this, you're peeling away the layers of the song, and you're hearing the little details that go into the song that maybe are hard to hear just by itself. I mean, listen to this sort of crash cymbal hit on the first hit of the first beat of the song. Now, I think if you listen for it, you can hear it in the actual mix. But without the side thing, I didn't even know this existed at all. Say you're trying to remake the song and you wanted to figure out what the melody was of these little plucks in the background. Much easier to see that than on the full. Much easier to see on the side only information than on the full mix. And also just want to bring attention, so listen to how many sound effects and the distortion and the detail, these extra layers in Wheatland's song. And just goes to show you how much more detail he has in his song than I think I've been putting in my songs. And it really does show me that I need to put a little more effort into these little tiny ear candy things that maybe aren't so obvious in the full mix, but definitely add to the professional quality of his songs. And the second thing I like to use is you can also do this obviously with the mono only. So similar to the side only EQ, you can go for the mono only EQ and just listen to stuff in the mids. And this helps to figure out what stuff's in the mids versus is in stereo. So for example, on this song here, the What's Not Lone Slow Hours remix. There's a lot of sound going on, but it's hard to hear exactly what instruments creating what sound. Specifically, the saw bass and the chords are mixed together pretty similarly. So if you use side only, we hear very little saw information, a lot of bass information. We go mid only. Much more saw information. That's because I think the saws are mostly placed in the mono field, and the stereo field is occupied by that bass. One of the coolest examples I can think of when using this technique is if you use a left and right only EQ before a spectrum analyzer, and then turn the spectrum analyzer to just look at that channel. So for instance, I have my EQ set to left and right mode, and I've taken away all the right side and just the left side. And we're going to listen. I found some interesting stuff from listening to Flume's Tennis Court remix. Look at these saw stack, you can see goes from about D2 to F3. Yeah, D sharp 2 to F3. Now if we just switch to the right channel only, we see this. From D3 to G4. And that's a whole octave difference. And really this is super interesting to me because it showed me that what Flume actually did in this song was he had two saw layers, and instead of just sort of hitting the D tune and just pitching or panning some stuff to the left and panning some stuff to the right, he had essentially a whole different octave playing on the right ear and the left ear. And you can actually hear this in the whole mix if you listen carefully, but it's not so clear. But they're similar volume. But if you just isolate the left only side, this is what I mean by you can really unlock these secret techniques these musicians or your favorite artists are using in their productions, because I mean, this was very interesting to me to see that Flume was using essentially two entirely different octave synth patches, one pan left, one pan right, to sort of create this imbalance in the stereo field. And it's something I'm definitely going to try to experiment with in the future if I ever make songs with saw stacks like this. So finally, I want to talk about the settings that I like to use for Spectrum Analyzer as well as Voxengo Span. So first of all, I like to just use the Spectrum Analyzer on the master channel so it doesn't take up too much CPU usage. So I just have sort of one on my whole project. And I set the block slips to the highest possible, 16,000. Refresh rate down as low as I can, and just set the scale to auto. I think this gives me the clearest picture of what the song is doing at any given time. And so for Voxengo Span, the one that I've decided, I've written my own preset, which most closely mimics Ableton's view. And what you do is you go and you customize a set. Window type is Han, type RT average, block size 16,000. You can go above that, but I don't really get much of a difference if you go above 16,000. Overlap up, and then the thing you want to play with is the average time. It's set it between 600 to 900. And this will give you this most similar to Ableton's, and then everything up here is sort of optional to taste. And there are a bunch more interesting things you can do with Voxengo Span. For instance, you can actually zoom in really tight on Voxengo Span and look at individual frequencies. So this can be like finding out how much FM a sound has, or figuring out the vibrato rate, or figuring out the detune of a synth. There's a lot more advanced techniques I can go into in a second video, but I think this is like the basics of how you can use spectrum analyzers to aid yourself in making better music and understanding what your favorite artists are doing in their songs.